Picture this. A hulking freighter slides into Tangjin port, metal groaning, cranes leaning over like giant arms. The ship holds 300,000 tons of soybeans, sacks stacked like a small mountain. On paper, everything looks perfect, origin listed as Argentina, paperwork stamped, shipping route logged. But when inspectors begin sampling, the unloading comes to a dead stop. Scientists run tests, machines beep. A customs officer holds up a lab printout and says 3 words that stop the world of trade for a heartbeat. This isn't Argentine. That moment, a whole ship turned away, is the opening of our story. It's dramatic because it's rare. Nations don't usually send back entire cargoes, but it's also a detective story. The clues are small and technical, a protein percentage here, a serial number on a sack there. Yet the consequences are enormous. Imagine a supermarket suddenly losing most of its cooking oil, or a chicken farm unable to get feed. That's how a shipment at one dock can ripple through millions of kitchens and businesses. Why start here? Because this single event condenses everything we'll explore. Geopolitics, hidden economics, clever tricks, and high-tech detective work. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened to that ship, but why someone would try to disguise 300,000 tons of soy, and how science and data can pull the mask off. Next, we'll zoom out and explain why soybeans are worth the drama. Why an ordinary bean can suddenly become a matter of national security and global money. To understand why a shipment of soybeans could spark such global attention, we need to look at the bean itself. Small, yellow, and surprisingly powerful. Soybeans aren't just food, they're the backbone of modern agriculture. Crush them, and you get 2 valuable things: oil for cooking, and meal that feeds billions of chickens, pigs, and fish around the world. In short, soybeans are the quiet engine behind meat, dairy, and much of the food economy. Now imagine a country like China, 1.4 billion people, growing middle class, and an endless appetite for pork, chicken, and seafood. Every one of those industries relies heavily on soy-based feed, yet China can't grow enough soy at home. In 2024, it produced about 20 million tons, but the demand was more than 5 times higher. That gap, over 100 million tons, has to be filled through imports. So, China buys soybeans the way most countries buy oil, in bulk, non-stop, from whoever can supply them. In 2024, it imported about 105 million tons of soybeans, spending nearly $51 billion. Think about that. For every 100 yuan China spends on grain imports, more than 70 goes just to soy. Brazil supplies most of it, the United States is second, and Argentina a distant but vital third. This means soybeans aren't just crops, they're strategic assets. If trade flows change, meat prices rise, factories pause, and entire industries feel it. That's why one suspicious cargo from Argentina wasn't seen as a minor customs issue. It was a warning sign in a supply chain that feeds a billion people. And right behind this agricultural dependence is the real driver of our story, politics. To see how soybeans got tangled in global politics, we need to rewind to early 2025. Donald Trump is back in the White House, and just like his first term, he wastes no time targeting China. Within weeks, his administration slaps a 10% tariff on all Chinese imports, and by April, that number skyrockets to a shocking 145%. Overnight, trade between the world's 2 biggest economies starts to choke. China, of course, doesn't sit still. Within days, Beijing hits back, imposing new taxes on American coal, oil, and especially agricultural goods. The message is clear. If the U.S. wants a trade fight, China will match it blow for blow. Soon, American chicken, corn, pork, and wheat face extra tariffs, and one crop takes the hardest hit: soybeans. Before the tariffs, the U.S. used to sell over 36 million tons of soybeans to China every year. But now, those beans sit unsold in warehouses across the Midwest, mountains of yellow seeds with nowhere to go. American farmers are desperate. Prices collapse, silos fill up, and exporters start losing billions. At the same time, Chinese importers are scrambling to find alternative suppliers so their livestock industries don't run dry. This is where the cracks start to show. Because in every trade war, when official channels close, unofficial ones open. When tariffs make legal trade impossible, traders look for loopholes. It's the same logic that drives smugglers, just on a massive global scale. If U.S. soybeans can't be sold to China directly, maybe, just maybe, they can take a detour. That's how we reach the strange idea that soybeans could travel halfway around the world, pick up a new label, and then sneak back into China disguised as something else. The pressure to survive, on both sides, creates the perfect storm for deception. Think of this scheme like a movie costume change, but for 300,000 tons of beans. Traders who wanted to sell U.S. soy to China couldn't do it directly because of tariffs and bans, so they tried to disguise the cargo's true identity. Here's the step-by-step of how that costume change worked, explained simply. First leg. Move the beans to South America. The soy was loaded onto freighters in the U.S. Midwest, sailed down the Atlantic, and arrived at ports in Argentina or Brazil. On paper, it looks like ordinary trade. A ship docks, cargo is recorded, and new paperwork is issued. But the key point is this: the beans didn't grow there. They were just passing through, repackaging and relabeling. At the destination, the bulk soy could be transferred into locally branded sacks or containers that say, "Product of Argentina." Sometimes seeds are mixed with a small amount of local soy, or simply repackaged into local bags. Imagine stealing a designer jacket, sewing in the label of a local brand, and hoping no one notices. That's the idea at scale. Forged certificates of origin. International trade relies on documents, invoices, bills of lading, and certificates of origin that state where the goods were grown. Fraudsters can fabricate these papers or bribe intermediaries to stamp false origins. The documents make the shipment legal on paper, even if they lie about the truth. Route and timing cover-ups. Traders manipulate shipping routes and change carrier names to mask the cargo's history. They might use third-party brokers, falsified AIS logs, or intermediate stops so the trail looks Argentine. It's like trying to erase fingerprints by changing gloves several times. Mixing and dilution tactics. Another trick is mixing a large quantity of cheap U.S. soy with a smaller batch of local soy to create a mix that technically has some local origin. If done cleverly, this can obscure lab test differences, at least in theory. Scale makes it worth the risk. Why go through all this trouble? Because with millions of dollars on the line, even a small percentage saved on tariffs can pay for the extra logistics, bribes, and risks. When you move cargo by the hundreds of thousands of tons, the math can look attractive, until you get caught. These moves were not random or amateurish. They're a form of industrial-scale fraud, coordinated, logistical, and high stakes. But here's the catch. Paper and bags can be faked, but the beans themselves carry their origin in measurable ways. That's the weak point of the disguise, and it's what leads us to the next section. How Chinese customs used science and data to peel off the costume and expose the true source of the cargo. This is the detective chapter, where paper lies meet hard proof. Customs didn't rely on a single test or a gut feeling. They used a stack of methods that, together, act like a forensic team. Microscopes and mass spectrometers in one hand, shipping data and AI in the other. Here's how they peeled back the disguise. Chemical fingerprints. The beans don't lie. Soybeans carry tiny chemical signals shaped by soil, climate, and farming methods. Simple tests, like measuring protein content, can already be telling. Argentine soy tends to show slightly lower protein levels than many U.S. varieties because of differences in climate and harvest timing. So, when a supposedly Argentine cargo returned a protein reading of 35.1%, while Argentine benchmarks rarely top 34%, that raised the first red flag. Think of protein content as a shoe size, not definitive alone, but suspicious when it doesn't match the expected fit. Isotopes and trace elements. Nature's fingerprint. For more certainty, labs run advanced tests, isotope analysis and trace element profiling using mass spectrometers. These tools measure tiny ratios of atoms, like nitrogen or carbon isotopes, or trace metals absorbed from local soils. It's the scientific equivalent of DNA for plants, a pattern that matches a region's geology and climate. When the isotope signature lines up with the U.S. Midwest rather than the pampas of Argentina, that's very strong evidence. Physical clues, the sacks and cereals. Not everything is in a lab. Inspectors found physical evidence too. The sacks themselves, printing marks, or supplier barcodes that trace back to U.S. manufacturers. It's like finding a shop receipt in someone's pocket. Small but damning when combined with lab results. Digital forensics. Ships leave a trail. Ships and containers leave digital footprints. AIS tracks, port calls, container movement logs, and bills of lading. Chinese authorities cross-check the vessel's route, timestamps, and handovers. If the AIS path shows the cargo came straight from a U.S. port then made a quick staged stop before claiming a new origin, that looks shady. Digital records often reveal steps that paperwork tries to hide. AI, databases, and traceability systems. The pattern detector. Customs now use databases and AI to watch for anomalies. Sudden price jumps, odd routing patterns, or origin claims that don't match seasonal harvest calendars. Blockchain-style birth certificates for crops, recording where a batch was planted, when it was harvested, and how it moved, add another layer. When multiple indicators, lab, physical, and digital, all point the same way, the confidence becomes very high. Putting it all together, a mosaic, not a single tile. Individually, any one clue could be questioned. But combined, protein readings inconsistent with Argentina, isotope patterns matching the U.S., American-made sacks, and suspicious AIS routes, they form a mosaic that's hard to deny. That's why Customs didn't just reject the shipment on paperwork alone. They rejected it because the science and the data told a consistent story. Let's make this painfully simple. People cheat when the reward looks bigger than the risk. For exporters trying to get U.S. soy into China during a tariff fight, re-exporting through Argentina can look like a shortcut from can't sell to big payday. Here's how that logic works, with a small, clear example so you can see the math. The basic incentive. Tariff gaps create money on the table. If China slaps heavy tariffs or outright bans on U.S. soy, the effective price that a Chinese buyer would have to pay for American beans jumps. But if the same beans show up as Argentine, they avoid those extra charges and can be sold at the lower normal import price. That price difference, even if it's just a few percent per ton, becomes huge when you're moving hundreds of thousands of tons. A simple example, not exact market quotes, just illustrating the idea. Imagine the baseline market price for soy is $400 per ton. A punitive tariff raises the landed price of U.S. soy by 30%. That's $120 extra per ton. If a trader can disguise those beans as Argentine and sell them without the $120 penalty, they pocket most of that difference. Move 300,000 tons at a $120 gap, and the potential proceeds are $36 million, enough to justify extra costs and risks for some players. That's why scale matters. These are not shady side deals with a few sacks. When you move millions or hundreds of thousands of tons, even a modest per-ton spread multiplies into millions of dollars. The cost side, why traders still sometimes gamble. Repackaging, falsifying documents, extra shipping legs, bribes, and logistics add cost and time. But compared to the multi-million-dollar payoff on a big shipment, those costs can look small. Traders do a quick risk-reward calculation, expected profit minus cost minus expected penalty. If the expected penalty, probability of getting caught times size of fine or loss, looks lower than the likely gain, some will take the chance. Practical reasons Argentina or Brazil are attractive transshipment points. Existing export infrastructure. Argentina and Brazil already export big volumes of soy to China, so arrivals from those countries aren't unusual. Local packaging and documentation. Ports and warehouses can rebag or blend shipments, and a forged origin stamp blends into the noise of normal trade. Market access. Chinese buyers keep sourcing from Brazil and Argentina, so a shipment labeled from those countries can usually enter the supply chain faster. Why mixing or partial blending is tempting and risky. Some tried dilution mix U.S. beans with a smaller amount of local beans to blur the lab signals. If half the cargo really is Argentine, the theory goes, lab tests might be inconclusive. But blending also changes product specs and is traceable if tests are done carefully. And modern forensic checks can still pick apart the mixture. The hidden assumptions in the plan, and where it breaks. These schemes assume weak testing, sloppy paperwork checks, and uncoordinated digital records. But when customs use advanced lab tests, AIS shipping logs, and traceability databases together, the scheme's weak points appear: sacks with U.S. barcodes, isotope patterns that match Midwest soil, or a shipping route that shows a recent U.S. origin. At scale, one failed assumption is enough to wipe out the profit and trigger diplomatic fallout. So the motive is plain: avoid a tariff, capture a big per-ton profit, scale the play across huge volumes. The method works only so long as detection and penalties are limited. When detection improves, as it did here, the math flips and the scheme collapses.